when Caleb Rowan handed over 35 crumpled dollars for a piece of forgotten Arizona wasteland, he thought he was buying solitude. Instead, he discovered 3 Apache sisters hanging by their necks from his front porch, still breathing, still fighting for life. What he didn't know was that saving them would unleash a war over the most valuable secret the desert had ever buried, a hidden water source worth more than all the gold in California. This is the story of how a drifter's desperate gamble became a battle for justice, survival, and redemption in the unforgiving American West. If you're ready to ride into this epic tale of courage and vengeance, stay with me until the very end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels across the land we call home. The Arizona sun hung like a merciless judge over the wasteland, its rays cutting through the desert air with the precision of a cavalry saber. Caleb Rowan pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes as he guided his tired mare along the dusty trail that led to what the land office clerk had called the Meridian property. $35. That's all it had cost him, $35 for 40 acres of what looked like God's own punishment, a stretch of land so forsaken that even the buzzards seemed to avoid it. The horse beneath him wheezed with each labored step, her ribs showing through, a coat dulled by too many hard miles and too little grain. Like her rider, she had seen better days. Caleb's own reflection in the occasional puddle of standing water told a similar story, hollow cheeks shadowed by a week's worth of stubble eyes that had looked upon too much violence and not enough peace. At 34, he carried himself like a man twice his age, shoulders bowed by invisible weights that no amount of whiskey or prayer had been able to lift. "Easy now, Duchess," he murmured to the mare, his voice rough from disuse. It had been 3 days since he'd spoken to another human being, and even longer since he'd wanted to. Just a little further and we can both rest. The landscape around them told a story of abandonment and neglect. Scrub brush clung desperately to rocky soil that looked like it hadn't seen rain in months. In the distance, the skeletal remains of what might once have been a fence line stretched across the horizon like broken teeth. This was frontier land in its rawest form, unforgiving, uncompromising, and utterly indifferent to the dreams of men who thought they could tame it. But that indifference was exactly what Caleb was looking for. After Gettysburg, after watching boys who should have been courting pretty girls instead die screaming in muddy fields, after the long, bitter years that followed when the uniform came off, but the war never really ended. After all of that, he wanted nothing more than to disappear into a place where the past couldn't follow and the future demanded nothing of him. The deed in his saddlebag was proof of his commitment to that dream. Purchased from a land speculator in Tucson who seemed eager to unload the property, it represented the sum total of Caleb's worldly ambitions, 40 acres of nowhere far enough from civilization that a man could live and die without troubling anyone or being troubled in return. As they crested a low rise, the ranch buildings came into view, and Caleb's first impression was that he might have gotten exactly what he'd paid for. The main house, if it could be called that, was a squat adobe structure that looked like it had been built by someone with more enthusiasm than skill. Its walls bore the scars of too many seasons, without proper maintenance, and several of the wooden shutters hung at odd angles like broken wings. A barn that had seen much better days leaned precariously to one side, its roof partially collapsed, and its doors standing open like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. But it was the silence that struck him most forcefully. Not the peaceful quiet of a place at rest, but the oppressive stillness of something held in suspended animation, as if the very air was waiting for permission to breathe. Even the wind, which had been his constant companion throughout the long ride from Tucson, seemed to die away as they approached the buildings. Duchess snorted nervously, her ears twitching at sounds Caleb couldn't hear. Horses he'd learned long ago had a sense for things that men often missed: danger, death, the lingering presence of violence. He patted her neck reassuringly, but his own hand moved instinctively to the worn grip of the Colt revolver at his hip. Steady, girl, probably just coyotes passing through. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were a lie. This feeling, this electric tension that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, was one he recognized from the war. It was the feeling of walking into an ambush, of stepping onto ground that had been soaked in blood and fear. As they drew closer to the house, details that had been obscured by distance began to emerge with disturbing clarity. Deep gouges in the adobe walls that looked suspiciously like bullet holes, dark stains on the ground that the desert sun hadn't been able to bleach away, and there, near what had once been a well, the splintered remains of wooden crosses that had been torn down and scattered by wind or intention. Caleb brought Duchess to a halt about 50 yards from the front of the house, his soldier's instincts screaming warnings that his desperate need for solitude tried to ignore. The smart thing would be to turn around, ride back to Tucson, and demand his money back from the land speculator. Find another piece of nowhere that didn't come with the smell of old death clinging to its bones. But $35 was all the money he had in the world, and pride, that stubborn, stupid pride that had gotten him into more trouble than he cared to remember, wouldn't let him admit defeat before he'd even set foot on his own land. "Hello, the house," he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the stillness. "Anyone home?" The only response was the distant cry of a hawk somewhere high overhead, its call sharp and mournful in the desert air. Caleb dismounted slowly, his right leg protesting with the familiar ache of an old wound that had never quite healed properly. He led Duchess toward what appeared to be the most stable-looking section of the barn, speaking to her in low, soothing tones that were as much for his own benefit as hers. "Just going to take a look around, girl, get the lay of the land, so to speak." The barn's interior was a study in abandonment. Stalls that had once housed livestock now stood empty, their gates hanging open like prayers left unanswered. The smell of old hay and leather lingered in the air, mixed with something else, something that made Caleb's nose wrinkle in distaste and recognition. Death, old death, but death nonetheless. He unsaddled Duchess and rubbed her down with a piece of relatively clean burlap he found hanging from a nail, taking his time with the familiar routine while his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light inside the barn. Military training had taught him the value of patience, of observing before acting, and what he observed now did nothing to ease his growing unease. Scratches in the wooden support posts that looked like claw marks, a broken bridle that had been cut rather than unbuckled, and there, half hidden beneath a pile of moldering straw, the unmistakable gleam of brass, a cartridge case that hadn't been there long enough to tarnish completely. "What the hell happened here?" he murmured to himself, picking up the spent shell and turning it over in his fingers. 44-40 caliber, probably from a Winchester rifle, the kind of weapon a man used when he meant business. With Duchess settled as comfortably as circumstances allowed, Caleb turned his attention to the house itself. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. He approached it like he'd once approached enemy positions, careful, quiet, ready for whatever might be waiting inside. The door swung open at his touch with a prolonged creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The interior of the house was a single large room with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a rough wooden table occupying the center of the space. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the shutters, creating a checkerboard pattern of light and shadow across the packed earth floor. But it was what hung from the ceiling beam that made Caleb's blood run cold. 3 lengths of rope, each ending in a noose, swayed gently in the hot air that drifted through the open door. They were positioned at different heights, as if they'd been measured for 3 different people, one tall, one medium, one shorter. The rope was relatively new, its fibers still retaining some of their original color despite exposure to the elements. "Jesus Christ." Caleb breathed, his hand moving once again to his weapon. Beneath each noose, the dirt floor was disturbed, scuffed and scattered as if by struggling feet. Dark stains that could have been blood or could have been spilled coffee or wine, he told himself, without conviction, marked the ground in irregular patterns. This wasn't just an abandoned ranch. This was a crime scene. Caleb backed out of the house slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. His mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Claim jumpers who'd met their end at the hands of vigilantes, rustlers caught in the act and subjected to frontier justice, or something worse, something that the decent part of his mind didn't want to contemplate. Whatever had happened here, it was clear that his dream of peaceful solitude had just become considerably more complicated. He was halfway back to the barn when he heard a sound so faint he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. A whisper of movement barely audible above the desert wind. It came from somewhere behind the house in the direction of what looked like it might once have been a garden or corral. Every instinct told him to saddle Duchess and ride away as fast as her tired legs could carry them. But something else, curiosity, stubbornness, or perhaps just the soldier's inability to retreat from potential danger, compelled him forward. The back of the house revealed more evidence of violence. Broken pottery scattered across the ground. A wooden fence that had been torn down its posts, snapped off at ground level, and there, near what had once been a well, something that made Caleb's heart skip a beat. 3 figures hanging from the gnarled branches of an ancient mesquite tree, but these weren't the desiccated remains he'd expected to find. These were people living, people barely conscious, but unmistakably alive. 3 young Apache women, their feet just touching the ground, the weight of their bodies supported more by the thick branch above than by the ropes around their necks. "Holy hell," Caleb whispered, breaking into a run. The first woman appeared to be the oldest, perhaps 25, with long black hair that fell like a curtain around her face. Her clothing a mixture of traditional Apache dress and what looked like pieces of white woman's clothing was torn and dirty, but she was breathing. The second was younger, maybe 20, her face bearing the sharp, proud features that Caleb had learned to associate with the Apache people during his time in the Territorial Army. The third was hardly more than a girl, 16 at most, her small frame making the rope around her neck seem all the more obscene. All 3 were unconscious but alive. Caleb drew his knife and went to work on the ropes with frantic efficiency, starting with the youngest. The hemp was thick and new, requiring several seconds of sawing before it parted with a soft snap. The girl collapsed into his arms, her body limp but warm, her breathing shallow but steady. He laid her gently on the ground and moved to the second woman, his hands working with the desperate precision of a field medic. These women had been here for hours, possibly days, kept alive only by the mercy of whoever had positioned them so that their feet could bear some of their weight. As he cut down the second woman, she stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. "Easy," he said softly, catching her as she fell. "You're safe now. I've got you." The third woman, the oldest, was heavier, and Caleb had to brace himself as the rope parted and she collapsed against him. But as he lowered her to the ground, her eyes opened, dark and fierce and filled with a wariness that spoke of terrible experience. "Who?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Name's Caleb Rowan," he said, kneeling beside her while keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "I bought this place, just rode in an hour ago." She tried to sit up, winced, and settled for studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You're not with them?" "With who?" But before she could answer, the youngest girl began to cough harsh, racking sounds that brought flecks of blood to her lips. Caleb turned his attention to her, checking her pulse and breathing, while the older woman watched with growing alertness. "We need to get them inside," he said, more to himself than to her. "Get some water, some food, figure out what the hell happened here." "You don't know." The woman's voice was stronger now, but tinged with disbelief. "Lady, I don't know anything except that I paid $35 for what I thought was an empty ranch, and instead I find 3 women about to be murdered on my front yard." She stared at him for a long moment as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. Finally, she nodded. "My name is Nayeli," she said. "These are my sisters Sana and Tiva." She gestured toward the younger women. "And if you truly don't know what happened here, then you've bought more than land, white man. You've bought a war." Before Caleb could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses drifted across the desert air, multiple riders moving fast and with purpose. Nayeli's face went pale. "They're coming back." "Who's coming back?" "The men who put us here." Her voice was urgent now, fear breaking through the carefully maintained composure. "The men who killed our people and stole our land." Caleb's hand moved to his Colt, but he knew that 6 shots wouldn't be nearly enough if he was facing multiple riders. "Can your sisters travel?" "Sana can, Tiva." Nayeli looked at the youngest girl who was still struggling to breathe properly. "Tiva needs time." The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer. "The barn," Caleb decided. "We can defend it better than out here in the open." He scooped Tiva up in his arms, surprised by how light she was, while Nayeli helped Sana to her feet. The middle sister was groggy but mobile, leaning heavily on Nayeli as they made their way toward the barn as quickly as they could manage. They had just reached the relative safety of the barn's interior when the first rider came into view over the low rise. Caleb positioned himself at the partially open door, his revolver drawn, while the 3 sisters huddled in the shadows behind him. 5 men on horseback approached the house at a steady trot, their movements suggesting familiarity with the property. They were hard-looking men, the kind Caleb had encountered too often during his years as a territorial soldier, rough, weathered, and comfortable with violence. Their leader was a tall, lean man with pale eyes and a carefully groomed mustache who rode like someone accustomed to command. "Damn," the leader said as they drew near the mesquite tree. "Looks like someone cut down our decorations." "Fresh tracks leading to the barn, Mr. Crowley," called one of the other riders, a heavy-set man with a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. Crowley. Caleb filed the name away for future reference as he watched the men dismount and begin to spread out their hands, resting casually on their weapons. "Well, well," Crowley called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance between the barn and the house. "Looks like we've got ourselves a good Samaritan. Why don't you come on out, friend, and we can discuss this like civilized men." Caleb remained silent, his eyes tracking the movements of the scattered riders. 2 had moved to flank the barn from the left, while one was working his way around to the right. Classic military tactics, they'd done this before. "I know you can hear me, friend." Crowley continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the obvious threat in his words. "And I know you've got something that belongs to us. Now, we're reasonable men, and we understand that you might have acted out of simple Christian charity. No harm, no foul, as they say. You just send those 3 Apache whores on out, and we'll be on our way." Behind him, Caleb heard Nayeli's sharp intake of breath at the crude language. "What do you want with them?" Caleb called back, still remaining hidden behind the barn door. "Want with them?" Crowley laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Hell, friend, those 3 have caused us more trouble than a nest of rattlesnakes. They're wanted for murder, theft, and various other crimes against decent folks. We're just trying to see that justice gets done." "Funny kind of justice," Caleb replied. "Last I checked, hangings were supposed to be quick. Sometimes a man has to be creative when dealing with savages," Crowley said, his voice hardening slightly. "Now I'm going to ask you one more time, nice and polite. Send them out and nobody else has to get hurt." Caleb glanced back at the 3 sisters. Nayeli was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, while Sana had managed to prop herself up against a wooden post despite her obvious weakness. Tiva was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. "And if I refuse?" he called out. "Well, that would be unfortunate," Crowley replied. "See, we've got 5 men out here, and you've got, 6 shots in that hogue leg you're carrying. Odds don't much favor the house, if you take my meaning." The bastard was right, and they both knew it. In an open fight, Caleb wouldn't last 5 minutes against 5 experienced gunmen, especially when he had 3 injured women to protect. But sometimes a man had to make a stand regardless of the odds. "Here's my counteroffer," Caleb called out. "You boys mount up and ride away, and I'll forget I ever saw you. Otherwise, we're going to have ourselves a problem." The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind through the barn's gaps and the distant cry of that same hawk still circling somewhere overhead. Finally, Crowley spoke again, and this time there was no pretense of civility in his voice. "Have it your way, friend. Boys, burn them out." The next few seconds passed in a blur of motion and sound. Caleb saw one of the flanking riders produce a torch from his saddlebag. Apparently, they'd come prepared for this possibility. At the same time, the man on the right side of the barn kicked in a section of rotted wallboards and leveled a rifle at the interior. Caleb's first shot took the man with the rifle center mass, dropping him before he could fire. His second shot forced the torchbearer to dive for cover behind a water trough, the burning brand falling harmlessly to the ground. "Get down," he shouted to the sisters, as return fire began to pepper the barn walls. Splinters of wood flew as bullets tore through the ancient boards, filling the air with dust and debris. Nayeli had produced a knife from somewhere, a wicked-looking blade that spoke of Apache craftsmanship, and was crouched protectively over her youngest son's sister. Sana, despite her weakened condition, had found a rusty horseshoe that she held like a weapon. Caleb put 2 more shots through the barn door in the general direction of Crowley's voice, then pressed himself against the wall as more return fire sought his position. He was down to 2 rounds, and 5 men were still alive out there. "This is your last chance," Crowley shouted. "Give us the squaws, and we'll make it quick." The crude language sparked something in Caleb's chest, a familiar anger that he'd thought he'd left behind with his army uniform. He'd seen too much casual brutality during his years in the territories, too much violence directed at people whose only crime was being born into the wrong tribe at the wrong time. "Go to hell," he shouted back, and put his 5th shot through a gap in the wall where he'd seen movement. A cry of pain suggested he'd found his mark, but that still left at least 4 men out there, and he was down to 1 bullet. That's when Nayeli appeared at his shoulder, her knife gleaming in the dusty light. "There's a root cellar," she whispered urgently, "behind those grain sacks. It connects to an old mine shaft that leads up the hill behind the house. Can your sisters make it?" "Sana can. Tiva." She looked back at her youngest sister, still unconscious. "I won't leave her. Then we carry her." Before Nayeli could protest, Caleb had scooped Tiva up again, cradling her against his chest with one arm while keeping his revolver ready in the other hand. "Show me." Nayeli pushed aside a stack of moldering grain sacks, revealing a wooden trapdoor set flush with the barn floor. She lifted it carefully, wincing as the hinges creaked, and gestured for Sana to go first. The middle sister moved like a woman in pain, but she managed to lower herself into the darkness below without making any noise. Nayeli went next, then reached up to help Caleb lower Tiva into her arms. As Caleb prepared to follow them into the cellar, he heard Crowley's voice again, closer now. "Torch the whole damn thing. If they want to burn with their Apache friends, that's their choice." Caleb dropped through the trapdoor just as the first flames began to lick at the barn walls above. The cellar was cramped and musty, carved out of the rocky soil and reinforced with wooden beams that looked none too stable. But there, just as Nayeli had promised, was a narrow opening that led into darkness. "The mine shaft," Nayeli explained quietly. "It was worked out years ago, but it still connects to several exits up in the rocks." They moved through the tunnel single file, Caleb bringing up the rear, with Tiva in his arms. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, and he had to duck constantly to avoid low-hanging rock formations. Behind them, they could hear the roar of flames as the barn caught fire in earnest. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, winding through solid rock, and occasionally branching off into side passages that disappeared into impenetrable darkness. Nayeli led them with the confidence of someone who had traveled this route before, never hesitating at the various forks and intersections. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they emerged into daylight again. They were perhaps a quarter-mile from the ranch buildings, hidden among a jumble of rocks that provided excellent cover from anyone down below. From their vantage point, they could see the barn burning like a massive torch, black smoke billowing up into the desert sky. Crowley and his men sat their horses in a rough circle around the blaze, waiting to see if anyone would try to escape the flames. "They'll figure out we're gone eventually," Caleb said quietly, settling Tiva gently on a flat rock. "When the fire burns down and they don't find any bodies. By then we'll be long gone," Nayeli replied. But there was something in her voice, a resignation that suggested this wasn't the first time she and her sisters had been forced to run. "Running where?" Caleb asked. "Those men seem to know you pretty well. How long have they been hunting you?" Nayeli was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes fixed on the burning barn below. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of old pain and newer anger. "Since they murdered our father," she said. "Since they destroyed our village and scattered our people to the winds. Since they decided that what lies beneath this land is worth more than Apache blood." "What lies beneath the land?" Nayeli turned to look at him, and Caleb saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten, a mixture of hope and desperation that reminded him of soldiers he'd known who were down to their last bullet and their last prayer. "Water," she said simply. "The most precious thing in this desert. Enough water to turn 40 acres of wasteland into an empire." And as the barn collapsed in on itself with a roar of falling timber and flying sparks, Caleb began to understand that his $35 gamble had just become the most dangerous bet of his life. The smoke from the burning barn drifted across the desert like a funeral shroud, carrying with it the acrid smell of destroyed dreams and the bitter taste of violence. From their rocky perch, Caleb watched Crowley's men circle the smoldering ruins like vultures, their patience wearing thin as the flames died down and no bodies emerged from the ashes. Tiva stirred in his arms, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness slowly returned. When her eyes opened fully, they were wide with terror, darting frantically between Caleb's unfamiliar face and the familiar forms of her sisters. "Shh," Nayeli whispered, moving closer to take her youngest sister's hand. "We're safe for now. This man helped us. The fire—" Tiva's voice was barely audible, raw from the rope that had nearly killed her. "I can smell smoke. They burned the barn trying to flush us out," Sana explained, her own voice still weak but gaining strength. "We escaped through the old mine tunnel." Tiva tried to sit up, winced, and settled for turning her head to look down at the ranch buildings. The sight of Crowley's men still prowling around the property made her shrink back against the rocks. "They're still here," she whispered to her son. "They'll leave soon enough," Caleb said, though he wasn't entirely convinced of that himself. "Once they realize we're not coming back." "You don't know Silas Crowley," Nayeli said grimly. "He doesn't give up easily, and he can't afford to let us live." "Why?" Caleb asked. "What's so important about this water you mentioned that it's worth killing for?" Nayeli exchanged a long look with her sisters, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Sana nodded slightly, and Nayeli turned back to Caleb. "Our father was the keeper of the old knowledge," she began. "The stories and secrets that had been passed down through generations of our people. One of those secrets was the location of the underground river that feeds the desert springs for hundreds of miles around. Underground river. The Spanish called it El Rio Perdido, the Lost River. It flows through limestone caverns deep beneath the desert floor, surfacing only in a few hidden places. Most of those springs dried up or were lost over the years, but one remains, the biggest one, the one that could irrigate thousands of acres and support a city the size of Phoenix. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. And it's here on this land. Beneath it, Sana said. The wellhead is hidden in a cave system about a mile from the house. Our people have guarded the secret for generations, using the water to sustain our village while keeping its true scope hidden from outsiders. Until someone found out, Caleb guessed. Marcus Harrigan. Nayeli spat the name like a curse. He owns half the territory, already cattle ranches, mining claims businesses in 3 different towns. But it's not enough for him. He wants to control the water, and whoever controls the water controls everything else. So he came after your people. He tried to buy the information first, Tiva said quietly. Sent men to negotiate with our father. When father refused to sell our birthright, Harrigan decided to take it by force. The wind shifted, bringing with it the distant sound of voices from below. Crowley was shouting orders to his men, his patience clearly exhausted. They're getting ready to search the area, Caleb observed. We need to move. Where? Nayeli asked. Crowley has men posted at every town within 100 miles, and even if we could get past them, where would we go? This is our home, this is our land. Not according to the deed in my saddlebag, Caleb said quietly. The 3 sisters stared at him, and he could see the bitter understanding dawning in their eyes. You bought stolen land, Sana said flatly. Our village, our sacred places, our father's grave, all of it sold to you for $35. I didn't know, Caleb said. The man at the land office made it sound like the property had been abandoned for years. Abandoned? Tiva's voice rose with anger before Nayeli shushed her. We were driven off at gunpoint 3 months ago. The survivors scattered to the winds, afraid to return because Harrigan's men patrol the area constantly. What happened to your father? Murdered, Nayeli said simply, along with 17 other members of our tribe, shot down like animals when they tried to defend our homes. The casual brutality of it hit Caleb like a physical blow. He'd seen enough violence during his army years to know that the frontier could be a cruel place, but this went beyond simple land disputes or Indian raids. This was systematic extermination in service of greed. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. If I'd known, you would have what? Nayeli challenged. Refused to buy the land, left it for the next white man who came along with money in his pocket. Maybe, I don't know, but I sure as hell wouldn't have paid money to profit from murder. Below them, Crowley's voice carried clearly on the desert air. Spread out, check every rock, every cave, every damn cactus. They couldn't have gone far on foot. They're coming up here, Sana said urgently. Caleb scanned the rocky terrain around them, looking for better cover or an escape route. The landscape was rugged, but offered little in the way of concealment for 4 people, especially when one of them was still recovering from near strangulation. The cave system you mentioned, he said, the one that leads to the water source. How far is it? Too far for Tiva to walk, Nayeli replied. And even if we could reach it, we'd be trapped. There's only one way, in or out. Not necessarily a bad thing if we can defend it. Against 5 armed men. I've got 1 bullet left, Caleb admitted. But the cave gives us cover and it puts us on our home ground. You know the territory better than they do. It's not your fight, Sana said quietly. You don't owe us anything. You could walk away right now, tell Crowley you found us dead already, and be clear of this whole mess. Caleb considered that option for about 2 seconds. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. He could claim he'd arrived too late to save the 3 women, point Crowley toward some false trail, and then quietly disappear into the desert with his horse and his gear. In a week, he could be in California or Colorado, starting over somewhere that didn't come with blood on the deed. But he thought about those nooses hanging from the mesquite tree, positioned at different heights to accommodate 3 different necks. He thought about the casual cruelty in Crowley's voice when he'd called the sisters Apache whores. And he thought about something his father had told him long ago before the war changed everything. A man's got to stand for something, son, or he'll fall for anything. Like hell, it's not my fight, he said. Those bastards tried to murder 3 women on my property. Far as I'm concerned, that makes it personal. Nayeli studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth behind his words. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because she nodded slowly. All right then, but you need to understand what you're getting into. This isn't just about Crowley and his men. Harrigan has judges and all his pocket sheriffs on his payroll, and enough political influence to make sure that any official investigation goes nowhere. Even if we survive the next few hours, this fight is far from over. One problem at a time, Caleb replied. Right now, I'm more worried about staying alive long enough to worry about politics. The sound of boots scrambling over rocks was getting closer. Crowley's men were working their way up the hillside in a loose line, checking every potential hiding place. They had maybe 5 minutes before the searchers reached their position. The cave, Caleb decided. It's our best option. Tiva can't walk that far, Nayeli protested. Then I'll carry her. Which direction? Nayeli pointed northeast toward a series of jagged rock formations that looked like the spine of some massive prehistoric creature. Follow the ridgeline for about half a mile, then down into the canyon between those 2 peaks. The entrance is hidden behind a rockfall. Lead the way. They moved as quickly as they dared, with Sana leaning heavily on Nayeli while Caleb carried Tiva. The youngest sister had lapsed back into unconsciousness, her head lolling against his shoulder as they picked their way across the treacherous terrain. The desert landscape was unforgiving, all sharp rocks and hidden crevices that could turn an ankle or worse. More than once, Caleb had to stop and find an alternate route when the path ahead proved too dangerous for someone carrying an unconscious woman. Behind them, they could hear Crowley's men spreading out across the hillside, their voices carrying on the wind as they called out to each other. The search was systematic and thorough, leaving little doubt that these men knew their business. There, one of the searchers shouted, fresh tracks heading northeast. Damn, Nayeli muttered. They've found our trail. How much further? Caleb asked, already breathing hard from the exertion of carrying Tiva across the rough ground. Another quarter mile, but the last part is all loose rock. One slip and we'll bring half the hillside down on top of us. The sound of pursuit was getting closer. Caleb could hear individual voices now, Crowley's among them, directing his men with the efficiency of someone accustomed to command. Thompson, take the left flank. Rodriguez, stay on the trail. Mitchell, work your way around to the right in case they try to double back. Military tactics again. These weren't just hired guns, they were professionals, possibly ex-cavalry like himself. That made them infinitely more dangerous than common thugs. The ridgeline narrowed as they climbed higher, forcing them to move in single file along a path that was barely wide enough for one person. To their left, the ground dropped away into a canyon so deep that the bottom was lost in shadow. To their right, vertical rock walls offered no handholds or escape routes. Perfect place for an ambush, Caleb thought grimly. If Crowley's men caught them here, there would be nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Sana stumbled her legs, finally giving out after the long ordeal. Nayeli caught her before she could fall, but it was clear that the middle sister was at the end of her strength. Rest, Caleb said, lowering Tiva gently to the ground. Just for a minute. We don't have a minute, Nayeli replied, but she was breathing hard herself. Caleb checked his revolver, confirming what he already knew. 1 bullet left and 5 men still hunting them. The odds were getting worse by the minute. Tell me about this water source, he said quietly. If it's as valuable as you say, why hasn't Harrigan just taken it by force already? Because he doesn't know exactly where it is. Sana explained, her voice weak but determined. The cave entrance is hidden and the underground passages are like a maze. Our father only shared the complete route with 3 people. The 3 of you. And each of us knows part of the way, Nayeli confirmed. Separately, the information is useless. Together you're the key to Harrigan's empire, Caleb finished. That's why Crowley was keeping you alive. He needed all three of you conscious and able to talk. And that's why we can never let them take us. Tiva said weakly, her eyes opening again. Because what we know would give Harrigan control over water rights for half the territory. Thousands of people would become dependent on him for their survival. The scope of Harrigan's ambition was staggering. Not content with owning vast ranches and mining operations, he wanted to control the most basic necessity of life in the desert. It was a plan worthy of an emperor, and apparently he was willing to commit genocide to achieve it. "Movement on the ridge!" came a shout from below. "I can see them!" "Time to go," Caleb said, scooping Tiva up again. They resumed their desperate flight along the narrow ridge, but now they could hear their pursuers closing in behind them. The crack of rifle shots began to echo off the canyon walls as Crowley's men took long-range potshots at the fleeing figures. Most of the shots went wild, but one bullet struck the rock near Caleb's head, sending sharp fragments flying. Another shattered a section of the path just behind Sana, causing a small avalanche of loose stones. "There," Naeli pointed toward what looked like a solid wall of rock ahead. "The entrance." Caleb couldn't see any opening in the stone face, but he had to trust that Naeli knew what she was talking about. They were committed now, with nowhere to go but forward. As they drew closer, he began to make out the details of what had appeared to be a solid barrier. It was actually a massive rockfall with house-sized boulders piled against the canyon wall in a way that created a hidden passage between them. "Behind the third boulder from the left," Naeli instructed, "there's a gap just wide enough for one person." The entrance was so well concealed that Caleb probably would have walked past it even if he'd been looking for it. The gap between the rocks was barely 3 feet wide and angled in such a way that it was invisible from more than a few yards away. Naeli went first, disappearing into the shadows between the boulders. Sana followed, moving with the last reserves of her strength. Caleb came last, having to turn sideways to fit through the opening while carrying Tiva. The passage beyond was pitch black and barely wide enough for his shoulders. He could hear Naeli ahead of him, her footsteps echoing strangely in what sounded like a much larger space. "How far does this go?" he whispered. "About 50 yards to the main chamber," came her voice from the darkness. "But stay close. There are side passages that lead nowhere, and at least one that drops into an underground river." The thought of blundering into a hidden pit in the darkness was enough to make Caleb slow his pace, feeling his way carefully along the tunnel wall. The rock was smooth and cool to the touch, worn by countless years of flowing water. Behind them, the sound of pursuit had stopped, replaced by angry voices arguing about whether to follow them into the cave. "I don't like it," one of Crowley's men was saying. "Could be a trap, could be a dead end, could be full of rattlesnakes for all we know. Could be full of Apache warriors waiting to lift our scalps," added another voice. "Use your heads," Crowley snapped. "It's 3 women and 1 man, and we've got them cornered. Thompson, you and Rodriguez stay here and watch the entrance. The rest of us are going in." The decision sent a chill down Caleb's spine. In the open desert, they at least had mobility on their side. In these narrow tunnels, they would be sitting ducks if Crowley's men decided to rush them. "Naeli," he called softly, "how defensible is this cave system? The main chamber has several exits." Her voice echoed back. "But most of them require ropes to navigate safely. And there's something else you need to know." "What?" "We're not the only ones who know about this place. Harrigan's been here before with survey teams and engineers. He's mapped at least part of the tunnel system." That was definitely not what Caleb wanted to hear. If Harrigan's people were familiar with the cave layout, then Crowley might know about alternate entrances or escape routes. The tunnel finally opened into a vast underground chamber that took Caleb's breath away. Shafts of sunlight filtered down through cracks in the ceiling far above, creating pillars of golden light in the darkness. The air was cool and humid, filled with the sound of dripping water and the distant rush of an underground stream. And there, in the center of the chamber, was the source of all the conflict. A natural spring that bubbled up from deep within the earth, crystal clear and flowing at a rate that would have supplied a small town. "My God," Caleb breathed, setting Tiva down gently on a flat rock near the water's edge. "How much water does this produce?" 10,000 gallons a day, Sana said proudly. "Maybe more during the wet season. Enough to irrigate hundreds of acres or supply a city with fresh water year-round. And this is just the main spring," Nayeli added. "The underground river extends for miles in both directions, feeding smaller springs throughout the region. Control this source and you control water rights for half of Arizona territory." The scope of Harrigan's ambition was becoming clearer. With exclusive access to this underground river system, he could dictate terms to every rancher, farmer, and town within 100 miles. It would make him not just wealthy but powerful beyond measure. "No wonder he's willing to kill for it," Caleb said quietly. The sound of boots on stone echoed from the tunnel behind them, followed by the flicker of torchlight against the walls. "Company's coming," Caleb observed, checking his revolver one more time. One bullet against 3 armed men wasn't much, but it would have to do. "There are other passages," Nayeli said urgently. "We could try to reach one of the alternate exits and leave Tiva behind. She can barely walk. Then we make our stand here," Sana said, her voice growing stronger despite her physical weakness. "At least we'll be defending our ancestral home." Caleb positioned himself behind a large boulder that offered good cover while providing a clear field of fire toward the tunnel entrance. The sisters gathered around Tiva, Nayeli still clutching her knife, while Sana had found a hefty chunk of rock that she wielded like a club. "Listen," Caleb said quietly. "When the shooting starts, you 3 get behind that big stalagmite over there and stay down. Don't try to be heroes, just survive." "What about you?" Nayeli asked. "I'll buy you as much time as I can." The first torch appeared at the tunnel entrance, followed by Crowley's lean figure. He moved cautiously, his revolver drawn and ready, clearly aware that he was walking into a potential ambush. "Beautiful place," Crowley called out, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "I can see why your people fought so hard to keep it secret. But the secret's out now, ladies, time to come home." "This is our home," Nayeli called back. "You're the intruder here." "Not according to the territorial government," Crowley replied, advancing slowly into the chamber. "This land belongs to Marcus Harrigan, now bought and paid for. That makes you trespassers." 2 more men emerged from the tunnel behind Crowley, spreading out to cover the exits. Professional positioning again, they knew their business. "Harrigan has no legal claim to this place," Sana shouted. "This is Apache land protected by treaty." Crowley laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Treaties, lady, treaties are just pieces of paper. What matters is who has the guns and who has the political connections, and right now that's us." "Maybe," Caleb said, revealing his position behind the boulder. "But before you start celebrating, you might want to consider something. And what's that, friend? I've got 1 bullet left in this gun. Odds are good I can put it through your heart before your boys take me down. Question is, are you willing to die for Harrigan's water rights?" Crowley's advance stopped, and Caleb could see him calculating odds and angles in the torchlight. The man wasn't a coward, but he wasn't stupid either. "You know what I think," Crowley said finally. "I think you're bluffing. I think you're all out of ammunition and just trying to buy time. Only one way to find out." "True enough." Crowley raised his revolver. "But here's what I know for certain. I've got 3 bullets, Rodriguez has 6, and Mitchell's got a rifle with enough rounds to drop an elk. Even if you do put me down, my boys will turn this cave into your tomb." It was a grim calculation, and they both knew Crowley was right. But sometimes a man had to play the hand he was dealt, no matter how poor the cards. "Maybe," Caleb replied, "but you'll still be dead. That worth it to you?" The standoff stretched out for long seconds, neither man willing to make the first move. Then Tiva's weak voice broke the silence. "There's another way," she said, struggling to sit up despite her injuries. "A way that doesn't have to end in blood." "I'm listening," Crowley said, though his gun remained trained on Caleb's position. "A trade," Tiva continued. "We'll tell you how to find the water source in exchange for safe passage out of the territory." "Tiva, no," Nayeli said sharply. "It's our only chance," the youngest sister replied. "And maybe it's time to stop fighting a war we can't win." Caleb could see the internal struggle playing out on Nayeli's face, the desire to protect her sisters, warring with generations of tribal pride and the memory of their murdered father. "What kind of trade?" Crowley asked, interested despite himself. "Maps," Tiva said. "Detailed charts showing not just this spring, but the entire underground river system, every source, every access point, every branch of the network." "You have maps? Our father made them working with Spanish surveyors and Mexican cartographers over decades. They're hidden, but we know where to find them." Crowley lowered his gun slightly, greed overcoming caution. "And in exchange, safe passage to California, new identities, enough money to start over somewhere Harrigan's influence doesn't reach." It was a tempting offer, and Caleb could see Crowley considering it seriously. The maps would be worth a fortune to Harrigan, potentially more valuable than capturing the sisters themselves. But there was something in Tiva's voice, a subtle undertone, that suggested she wasn't telling the whole truth. Caleb caught Nayeli's eye and saw a flicker of understanding pass between the sisters. "Where are these maps hidden?" Crowley asked. "In a sacred place," Tiva replied. "A place only we can find. But it's not here. We'd have to travel there together." "How far?" 3 days' ride north, into the mountains." Crowley was definitely interested now, but he wasn't stupid. "And what guarantee do I have that you won't just disappear the first chance you get?" "What guarantee do we have that you won't just kill us once you have the maps?" Sana countered. "Fair point." Crowley thought for a moment. "All right, here's how we'll play it. One of you comes with me as insurance. The other two stay here with my men until we return with the maps." "No," Nayeli said flatly. "We stay together." "Then we have a problem," Crowley replied, raising his gun again. That's when the sound of approaching horses echoed from somewhere outside the cave system, multiple riders moving fast and making no effort at stealth. Crowley's head snapped toward the tunnel entrance, his expression shifting from confidence to concern. "Rodriguez, get back to the entrance and see who's coming." One of his men disappeared into the tunnel at a run, leaving only Crowley and Mitchell to cover 4 prisoners. The odds were still heavily against them, but they were improving. The sound of gunfire erupted from outside the cave, followed by shouting and the thunder of hooves. Rodriguez's voice could be heard yelling something unintelligible before it was cut off by another burst of rifle fire. "What the hell?" Mitchell muttered, his attention divided between the prisoners and the sounds of battle outside. That moment of distraction was all Caleb needed. He put his last bullet through Mitchell's chest, dropping the man instantly. At the same time, Nayeli launched herself at Crowley, with her knife moving with the fluid grace of a trained warrior. Crowley got his gun up just in time to block the blade, but the impact sent both weapons clattering across the stone floor. The 2 combatants rolled across the ground, Crowley's size and strength matched against Nayeli's speed and desperation. Sana grabbed Mitchell's fallen rifle, working the bolt action with shaking hands, while Caleb dove for Crowley's dropped revolver. Tiva, despite her weakness, had managed to crawl toward the underground stream, either seeking cover or preparing to escape through the water. The fight between Crowley and Nayeli was brutal and primitive, all claws and teeth and elbows. The man was trying to pin her arms while she went for his throat with her bare hands, both of them grunting with effort and pain. Caleb reached Crowley's gun just as the man managed to wrap his hands around Nayeli's throat. Without hesitation, Caleb put 2 bullets into Crowley's back, dropping him like a stone. The sudden silence in the cave was broken only by the sound of dripping water and Nayeli's ragged breathing. Outside, the gunfire had stopped as well, replaced by voices calling in Spanish. "Federales," Sana asked hopefully. "Doesn't matter who it is," Caleb replied, helping Nayeli to her feet. "We need to be ready for anything." Footsteps echoed from the tunnel, but these were different from Crowley's heavy boots, lighter, more cautious. A voice called out in accented English. "Hello in there, this is Sheriff Ellery from Tucson. Is everyone all right?" Caleb and the sisters exchanged surprised looks. Whatever they'd been expecting, it wasn't territorial law enforcement. "We're here," Caleb called back, "but we've got wounded." "Coming in," the sheriff replied. "Don't shoot, I'm one of the good guys." Sheriff William Ellery emerged from the tunnel a few moments later, followed by 3 deputies and what looked like a territorial marshal. He was a weathered man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and the kind of steady gaze that came from years of dealing with frontier violence. "Mr. Rowan, I presume," he said, extending a hand. "I've been looking for you." "Looking for me? Why?" "Because you bought a piece of property that's been at the center of a federal investigation for the past 6 months. Ellery's gaze moved to the 3 sisters. "And because these ladies have information that could help us put Marcus Harrigan behind bars for a very long time." The implications of Sheriff Ellery's words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Caleb studied the lawman's face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. After everything that had happened in the past few hours, trust didn't come easily. "Federal investigation?" Nayeli asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "How do we know you're not working for Harrigan like half the other lawmen in the territory?" Ellery reached slowly into his vest pocket, making sure his movements were clearly visible. He withdrew a leather folder and opened it to reveal a badge and official documents bearing federal seals. "Because I'm not territorial law, ma'am. I'm a U.S. Marshal working under special commission from the Department of Justice in Washington. We've been building a case against Marcus Harrigan for violations of federal water rights conspiracy to commit murder and illegal seizure of treaty lands." "Then why hasn't he been arrested?" Sana demanded, still clutching the rifle she'd taken from Mitchell's body. "Because we needed evidence that would stand up in federal court," one of Ellery's deputies explained. He was a younger man with intelligent eyes and the soft hands of someone more comfortable with legal documents than gun leather. "Harrigan's got judges and politicians in his pocket from here to Santa Fe. We needed ironclad proof of his crimes. And witnesses willing to testify," Ellery added, looking meaningfully at the 3 sisters. "People who saw firsthand what happened to your village." Tiva struggled to her feet, using the cave wall for support. Despite her obvious weakness, her voice carried the steel of someone who had endured too much to be intimidated by anything. "You want us to testify against Harrigan? In a white man's court? Tell me, Marshal, how many Apache have you seen receive justice in territorial courts?" It was a fair question, and Ellery had the decency not to offer false reassurances. "Not many," he admitted, "but this isn't a territorial court we're talking about. This is a federal case with federal judges and a federal jury. The rules are different. The rules are always different when it comes to Indian affairs," Nayeli said bitterly. "Different, but never better." Caleb understood their skepticism. He'd seen enough of frontier justice during his army years to know that the legal system rarely worked in favor of native peoples. But he'd also seen what happened when men like Harrigan were allowed to operate without consequences. "What kind of evidence do you have already?" he asked. Ellery gestured to the deputy with the soft hands. "Mr. Davidson here has been documenting Harrigan's activities for months. Financial records, correspondence, witness statements from survivors of other land acquisitions that followed the same pattern as what happened here." Davidson opened a leather satchel and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "Water rights purchased under false names, survey teams operating without proper permits, mining claims filed on treaty lands, and that's just the paperwork. We've also got testimonies from 3 former employees who were willing to talk about Harrigan's methods. Former employees who are now dead, Ellery added grimly. All 3 died in accidents within a week of agreeing to cooperate with our investigation. The cave fell silent except for the constant dripping of water and the distant sound of the underground stream. The scope of Harrigan's reach was becoming clearer, not just a territorial power broker, but someone with the resources and connections to eliminate federal witnesses. That's why we need your testimony, Ellery continued, addressing the sisters directly. You're the only surviving witnesses to what happened at your village. Without your statements, Harrigan walks free to do this again somewhere else. And if we testify, Nayeli asked, what guarantee do we have that we won't end up like your other witnesses? Federal protection, Davidson said quickly. New identities, relocation to somewhere safe, financial support to help you start over. Running away, Sana said flatly, abandoning our ancestral lands forever. Better than being dead, Ellery pointed out, and if Harrigan is convicted, there's a good chance the courts will void his illegal land purchases. Your people might be able to reclaim at least part of their territory. It was a tantalizing possibility, but Caleb could see the doubt in the sisters' faces. They'd been betrayed too many times by government promises to believe easily in justice. There's something else, Tiva said quietly. Something you need to know about Harrigan's plans. What kind of something? Ellery asked. He's not just after this water source. He's planning to dam the underground river system at multiple points, creating a monopoly on water distribution throughout the region. The surveys and engineering studies are already complete. Davidson's pen was moving rapidly across his notepad. How do you know this? Because our father was forced to guide one of the survey teams before they killed him, Nayeli explained. He saw the plans, heard them talking about construction schedules and political arrangements. What kind of political arrangements? Ellery's voice had taken on a sharp edge. Bribes to territorial officials, agreements with railroad companies for preferential shipping rates, contracts with mining operations for exclusive water access. Tiva's memory was proving remarkably detailed despite her recent trauma. They're not just planning to control the water, they're planning to control the entire economic development of the territory. The magnitude of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just about land grabbing or even genocide. It was about reshaping the entire political and economic landscape of the American Southwest. We need those survey documents, Davidson said urgently. If we can prove Harrigan was planning to violate federal water rights on this scale. They're hidden with the maps I mentioned to Crowley, Tiva said, in a sacred place in the mountains, but we'll never reach them if Harrigan's men are still hunting us. About that, Ellery said. We captured 2 of Crowley's men outside, but 3 others escaped. They're probably riding back to Harrigan's ranch right now to report what happened here. Caleb felt his stomach drop. How long before Harrigan sends reinforcements? 6 hours, maybe 8 if we're lucky. His main ranch is about 40 miles northwest of here, but he's got smaller operations scattered throughout the territory. He could have 20 men here by dawn. Then we need to move fast, Nayeli decided. The documents are hidden in a place called Whispering Canyon, about 20 miles north. It's rough country, but we can reach it in 6 hours if we push hard. All of us, Ellery asked, looking pointedly at Tiva's weakened condition. I can ride, the youngest sister said firmly, and I'm the only one who knows the exact location of the hiding place. Caleb admired her courage, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The ordeal of being hanged and then fleeing through the desert had taken a severe toll on her physical reserves. What about the ranch? He asked. If we abandon it now, Harrigan's men will destroy any evidence we might have left behind. There's nothing left to destroy, Sana said sadly. They burned our village to the ground, scattered our belongings to the wind. The only evidence that matters now is what's hidden in the mountains. And the water source? Caleb gestured toward the underground spring. We're just going to leave this for Harrigan to claim. It's been here for thousands of years, Nayeli said. It will still be here when we return with the law on our side. Ellery was already organizing his men for the journey ahead. Davidson, you'll stay here with Deputy Morrison to secure the scene and document everything for the federal investigators. The rest of us will escort the ladies to retrieve those documents. Marshal, Davidson said hesitantly. With respect, if Harrigan sends 20 men after us, 3 deputies aren't going to be enough protection, which is why we're not going to give him the chance to catch us, Ellery replied. We get in, get the documents, and get out before he knows we were there. It was a reasonable plan as far as it went, but Caleb had learned during his army years that reasonable plans had a way of falling apart when bullets started flying. I'm coming with you, he said. Ellery looked surprised. Mr. Rowan, you've already done more than enough. There's no need for you to risk your life further. Maybe not. But this is my land now, legally if not morally, and I've got a personal score to settle with anyone who tries to hang people on my property. The truth was more complicated than that. Somewhere in the past few hours, his feelings about the ranch had changed dramatically. What had started as a simple real estate transaction, a place to hide from his past, had become something else entirely. These people, this land, this fight for justice, had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead and buried at Gettysburg. Besides, he added, you're going to need every gun you can get if Harrigan's men catch up with us. Ellery studied his face for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. But I hope you understand what you're getting into. Harrigan's not going to forget that you interfered with his plans. Even if we win this fight, you'll be looking over your shoulder for a long time. Wouldn't be the first time, Caleb replied. They spent the next hour preparing for the journey. Ellery's men had brought extra horses and supplies, anticipating the need to transport witnesses. Tiva was given a gentle mare and a military saddle that would provide better support for her weakened condition. As they prepared to leave the cave, Nayeli approached Caleb with something in her hands, a small leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. What's this? He asked. Medicine, she said simply. Apache healing herbs for your leg. He looked down surprised. He hadn't realized that his old war wound was obvious to others, but apparently his slight limp was more pronounced than he'd thought. Thank you, he said, accepting the pouch. But I'm fine. No, you're not. And where we're going, you'll need every advantage you can get. Her dark eyes met his. The trail to Whispering Canyon is treacherous, even for healthy men, for someone carrying old injuries. I said, I'm fine. And I say, you're lying. There was no anger in her voice, just matter-of-fact observation. Men like you always lie about pain. You think it makes you weak to admit you're hurting. Doesn't it? Only if you let it control you instead of learning to work with it. She gestured toward the pouch. Steep the herbs in hot water tonight, drink the tea, and pack the wet leaves against the wound. It will help with the stiffness and reduce the inflammation. The casual kindness of the gesture caught him off guard. After everything she and her sisters had endured, Nayeli was still thinking about others' welfare. Why? He asked. Because you saved our lives. Because you're willing to fight for people you barely know. And because... She paused, looking for the right words. Because my father once told me that the measure of a person isn't whether they feel pain, but what they choose to do despite it. The comparison to her murdered father was both an honor and a responsibility that Caleb felt keenly. I won't let you down. I know, she said simply. The journey out of the cave system proved to be almost as dangerous as the entry had been. The alternate route Ellery's men had used to access the chamber was a narrow chimney that required ropes and careful climbing. Getting the horses through the rocky passages took precious time, and every minute they delayed increased the chances of running into Harrigan's reinforcements. When they finally emerged into daylight, the sun was already past its zenith, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and copper. The burned remains of Caleb's barn were visible in the distance, a stark reminder of how quickly circumstances could change. 20 miles to Whispering Canyon, Ellery said, checking his compass. If we maintain a steady pace, we should reach it by sunset. And if Harrigan's men catch up with us before then? Deputy Foster asked. He was the youngest of Ellery's team, probably not much past 20, with the kind of nervous energy that came from inexperience with real violence. Then we find defensive ground and make them pay for every yard, Ellery replied grimly. The trail north led through increasingly rugged terrain, following ancient Indian paths that wound between towering rock formations and across stretches of desert that seemed to exist in defiance of all logic. The horses had to pick their way carefully around loose stones and hidden crevices, making speed a constant challenge. Tiva rode between her sisters, her face pale but determined. Occasionally she would sway in the saddle, and either Nayeli or Sana would move closer to provide support. But she never complained, never asked to rest, never showed any sign of giving up. Tell me about this hiding place, Caleb said, riding alongside Nayeli as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail. Whispering Canyon is a sacred site, she explained. A place where our people have held ceremonies for generations. The walls are covered with ancient drawings that tell the history of our tribe. And your father hid documents there, in a special chamber that only the keepers of the old knowledge knew about. He thought they would be safe there, protected by the spirits of our ancestors. Do you believe that about the spirits? Nayeli was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I believe that some places hold power beyond what most people can understand. Whether that power comes from spirits or from the accumulated faith of generations, I'm not sure it matters. Behind them, Deputy Foster was scanning the horizon nervously. Marshal, we've got dust rising about 5 miles back. Could be a dust devil, but we can't afford to assume that, Ellery finished. How much further to the canyon? 8 miles. Tiva called back, her voice weak but audible. Maybe 9. 8 miles with potential pursuit, only 5 miles behind them. The mathematics were grim but not impossible. If they could maintain their pace and the terrain continued to favor mounted travel, they might just make it. But the desert had other plans. The trail began to climb more steeply as they approached the foothills of the mountain range that contained Whispering Canyon. What had been manageable terrain for tired horses became increasingly challenging, forcing them to slow their pace just when speed was most crucial. There, Sana pointed toward a gap between 2 massive stone pillars, the entrance to the canyon. From their current position, it looked like nothing more than a crack in the mountain wall, but as they drew closer, Caleb could see that it was actually a narrow passage that wound deeper into the rock formations. How far to the hiding place once we're inside? Ellery asked. 1/2 mile, Tiva replied, but the passage is narrow. We'll have to lead the horses on foot. The sound of approaching riders was clearly audible, now echoing off the rock walls around them. Caleb turned to look back and could make out individual figures silhouetted against the late afternoon sky, at least a dozen men riding hard and gaining ground rapidly. Harrigan's men, he asked. Has to be, Ellery said. Nobody else would be pushing horses that hard in this heat. They reached the canyon entrance with perhaps 10 minutes to spare. The passage beyond was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for a horse and rider, with vertical walls rising on both sides like the pages of an enormous stone book. This is perfect defensive terrain, Deputy Foster observed. If we posted men at the entrance, we could hold off an army. And trap ourselves in the process, Ellery pointed out. No, we stick to the plan. Get the documents and find another way out. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the heart of the mountain. The walls were covered with the ancient drawings Nayeli had mentioned, stylized figures of men and animals, symbols that spoke of a civilization far older than anything European settlers had brought to the New World. There, Tiva said, finally pointing to what looked like a solid wall of rock behind that stone. As they approached, Caleb could see that what appeared to be a continuous wall was actually a carefully concealed opening hidden behind a slab of stone that had been positioned to blend seamlessly with the surrounding rock face. "Help me move this," Nayeli said, putting her shoulder against the stone barrier. It took all of them working together to shift the massive slab enough to reveal the chamber beyond. The space was small, barely large enough for 3 or 4 people, but it was clearly artificial, carved out of the living rock by human hands. And there, wrapped in oiled leather and tucked into a niche in the far wall, were the documents that could bring down Marcus Harrigan's empire. Tiva crawled into the chamber and retrieved the package with trembling hands. When she emerged, her face was streaked with tears. "My father's work," she said softly. "The last thing he did before they killed him." The package contained not just maps and survey documents, but detailed records of water flow rates, geological surveys, and correspondence that revealed the full scope of Harrigan's conspiracy. There were letters from territorial officials promising cooperation in exchange for financial considerations, contracts with railroad companies for preferential shipping rates, and engineering plans for a dam system that would give Harrigan control over water distribution throughout the region. "This is incredible," Davidson breathed, scanning through the documents. "This is enough to bring down half the territorial government along with Harrigan, which is exactly why they can't be allowed to fall into the wrong hands," a new voice said from the canyon entrance. They all turned to see Marcus Harrigan himself, standing at the mouth of the passage, flanked by a dozen heavily armed men. He was not what Caleb had expected. Instead of the crude frontier bully he'd imagined, Harrigan was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to boardrooms as much as saloons. "Mr. Harrigan," Ellery said calmly, his hand moving slowly toward his weapon, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and violations of federal water rights." Harrigan laughed, a cultured sound that echoed strangely in the narrow canyon. "Marshal, I think you're confused about who has jurisdiction here. This is my land, purchased legally and in good faith from the territorial government." "Purchased with blood money," Nayeli spat. "Purchased with American currency in exchange for legal title," Harrigan corrected. "The fact that the previous occupants were too primitive to understand the concept of property ownership is hardly my concern." The casual racism in his words made Caleb's jaw clench. This was the enemy, not just a greedy businessman, but someone who genuinely believed that might made right and that some people mattered less than others. "Those documents belong to me," Harrigan continued. "They were stolen from my survey teams by hostile Indians, and I'm here to reclaim my property." "Your survey teams were trespassing on treaty lands," Ellery replied, "and the people you're calling hostile Indians were defending their legal homes." "Legal according to who? Some piece of paper signed by politicians in Washington who've never set foot west of the Mississippi." Harrigan's voice carried the conviction of someone who had told himself the same lies so many times that he'd come to believe them. "This is the frontier, Marshal. The law here is written in bullets and blood, not in leather-bound books." "Then I guess we understand each other," Caleb said quietly, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver, Harrigan's eyes fixed on him with interest. "And you are the man who owns the ranch you've been using as a killing ground." "Ah, Mr. Rowan, yes, I heard about your unfortunate purchase. Tell me, how does it feel to know you paid good money for worthless desert?" "Feels about like you'd expect," Caleb replied, "but I'm learning that the value of land isn't always measured in dollars." "How philosophical. Unfortunately, philosophy doesn't stop bullets." Harrigan gestured to his men, who began to spread out across the canyon entrance in a formation that would allow them to pour devastating fire into the narrow passage. "You're outnumbered 3-1, Harrigan pointed out. "Outgunned, trapped in a dead-end canyon, and completely cut off from any hope of reinforcement. I'm prepared to be reasonable, surrender the documents and the Apache women, and the rest of you can ride away from this." "And if we refuse," Ellery asked, "then you'll die here and I'll take the documents anyway. The only difference is how many widows get made today." The calculation was brutally simple. Even if they fought with perfect coordination and exceptional luck, they couldn't hope to overcome the numerical disadvantage. Harrigan had positioned his men with military precision, turning the canyon entrance into a killing ground. But surrendering meant condemning the three sisters to certain death and allowing Harrigan's conspiracy to proceed unchallenged. It meant accepting that justice was indeed nothing more than a luxury for those with enough guns to enforce their will. "There's a third option," Tiva said quietly, speaking for the first time since Harrigan's arrival. "I'm listening," the businessman replied. "Single combat," she said. "One of your men against one of ours. Winner takes everything." Harrigan looked genuinely surprised. "You're proposing trial by combat. How wonderfully primitive." "It's an old tradition," Nayeli said, picking up on her sister's plan. "Recognized by both Apache law and territorial statute. A way to settle disputes without unnecessary bloodshed." "And what makes you think I'd agree to such a thing?" "Because you're a gambling man," Sana said. "And because you know that even if you win this fight, the federal government will keep investigating. But if you defeat us in single combat witnessed by a federal marshal, it gives your claim a legitimacy that simple murder never could." It was clever psychology appealing to Harrigan's ego and his political instincts simultaneously. The man was clearly intrigued by the possibility of adding a veneer of legality to what would otherwise be simple massacre. "Who would fight for your side?" Harrigan asked. All eyes turned to Caleb, and he realized that somehow, without anyone saying it explicitly, the decision had already been made. He was the logical choice, the only one among them who had extensive combat experience and the physical capability to face Harrigan's champion. "I will," he said simply. "And for my side," Harrigan's gaze moved across his men before settling on a giant of a man who stood at least 6.5 feet tall and probably weighed close to 300 pounds. "Jacob Kane." Kane stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone who had never lost a fight. His arms were like tree trunks, his hands the size of dinner plates. Scars on his knuckles spoke of countless brawls, and the way he moved suggested that despite his size he was surprisingly quick. "Rules?" Ellery asked, clearly unhappy with the turn of events, but recognizing that they had few alternatives. "Simple," Harrigan replied. "Hand-to-hand combat until one man yields or can no longer continue. No weapons, no interference from either side. And the stakes: if Kane wins, I get the documents and the Apache women. If your man wins, we ride away and never return." It wasn't much of a guarantee. Harrigan's word was worth about as much as Confederate currency, but it was better than facing impossible odds in a straight gunfight. "Agreed," Ellery said reluctantly. The combat area was a roughly circular space about 20 feet across, bounded by natural rock walls on 3 sides and the assembled men on the 4th. Kane shed his shirt, revealing a torso covered in old scars and current muscle. Caleb kept his shirt on partly for modesty and partly to hide the extent of his war wounds from his opponent. "Ready," Harrigan called out. Kane didn't wait for an answer. He charged forward like a bull, relying on his size and strength to overwhelm his smaller opponent. But Caleb had learned long ago that size wasn't everything in a fight. Timing, positioning, and the willingness to absorb punishment in order to deliver it were often more important. He sidestepped Kane's initial rush, driving an elbow into the big man's ribs as he passed. It was like hitting a brick wall, but Kane grunted and turned more carefully for his second attack. This time he approached with more caution, his massive fists weaving in front of him like sledgehammers. When he struck, Caleb barely managed to get his arms up in time to block, and the impact sent him stumbling backward against the canyon wall. Cain pressed his advantage, pinning Caleb against the rock and driving punch after punch into his midsection. Each blow felt like being kicked by a horse, and Caleb could feel his strength beginning to fade under the relentless assault. But years of combat had taught him that sometimes the only way out was through. Instead of trying to escape the corner, he grabbed Cain's shirt and drove his knee upward with all the force he could muster. The knee caught Cain in the solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs and causing him to double over. Caleb followed up with an uppercut that snapped the big man's head back and sent him staggering across the fighting circle. Cain shook his head like an angry bear and charged again, but this time Caleb was ready. He dropped low and swept Cain's legs, sending the giant crashing to the ground with an impact that seemed to shake the entire canyon. Before Cain could recover, Caleb was on top of him, driving punch after punch into his face and throat. But the big man was tougher than he looked. He managed to grab Caleb's shirt and flip him over, reversing their positions and putting his massive weight to work. The next few minutes were a blur of pain and desperate struggle. Cain used his size advantage to control the fight, pinning Caleb down and methodically working to wear him down with a series of brutal punches. But Caleb had learned endurance in the hardest school imaginable, the battlefields of the Civil War, and he refused to give up despite the punishment he was taking. Gradually, he began to notice that Cain's movements were becoming less precise, his breathing more labored. The big man was strong, but he wasn't used to extended fights. He was accustomed to overwhelming opponents quickly through sheer physical dominance. When Cain paused to catch his breath, Caleb saw his chance. He managed to work one arm free and drove his fingers into a pressure point on Cain's neck that he'd learned from an Apache scout during his army days. The technique wasn't meant to cause permanent damage, but it could temporarily disrupt an opponent's balance and coordination. Cain jerked back in surprise, and Caleb used the momentary distraction to reverse their positions once again. This time, instead of trying to trade punches, he wrapped his arm around Cain's throat in a chokehold, using his legs to maintain position while the big man thrashed beneath him. "Yield," Caleb whispered in Cain's ear. "You're beaten. Don't make me finish this." For a moment, it seemed like Cain might continue fighting, but then his struggles began to weaken as the chokehold took effect, and finally he tapped the ground with his hand in the universal signal of surrender. Caleb released the hold immediately and rolled away, gasping for breath and tasting blood from where Cain's punches had split his lip. Every part of his body ached, and he could feel new bruises forming on top of old scars. "Well," Harrigan said after a moment of stunned silence, "I have to admit I didn't see that coming." "A deal's a deal," Ellery said firmly. "You gave your word in front of witnesses." "So I did." Harrigan's voice carried no trace of anger or disappointment. If anything, he sounded almost amused. "Very well, Marshal. You've won this round. We'll withdraw and leave you to your business." "Just like that?" Nayeli asked suspiciously. "Just like that," Harrigan confirmed. "I'm a businessman, not a barbarian. When I lose a wager, I pay up." He gestured to his men, who began backing toward their horses with obvious reluctance. But as they prepared to leave, Harrigan turned back one more time. "Enjoy your victory, Marshal, but remember this is still a very large territory, and I have a very long memory. Our paths will cross again." The threat was unmistakable, but there was nothing they could do about it now. They watched in tense silence as Harrigan's party mounted up and rode away, disappearing into the desert like a mirage. "That was too easy," Foster said when they were finally alone. "Men like Harrigan don't just give up because they lost a fistfight." "No, they don't," Ellery agreed grimly, "which means we need to get these documents to federal court as quickly as possible before he has a chance to regroup and try again." As the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the ancient stone in some shades of gold and crimson, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The desert night descended upon Whispering Canyon like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a bone-deep cold. that seemed to seep through clothing and settle in a man's very soul. Caleb sat beside a small fire that Deputy Foster had built in a sheltered alcove, pressing a damp cloth against his split lip while his ribs protested every breath. The fight with Cain had taken more out of him than he cared to admit, but the satisfaction of victory helped dull the pain. Across the fire, the three sisters huddled together beneath blankets that Ellery's men had provided, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. Tiva looked stronger than she had since the ordeal began, the food and rest beginning to restore some of her natural resilience. Sana was examining the recovered documents with the intensity of someone who understood their true value, while Nayeli maintained her vigil as the family's protector, her dark eyes constantly scanning the shadows beyond their small circle of light. "We can't stay here long," Ellery said quietly, settling down beside Caleb with a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been boiled over too many campfires. "Harrigan may have honored the terms of single combat, but that doesn't mean he's given up. Men like him don't build empires by accepting defeat gracefully." "How long to reach federal court?" Caleb asked, accepting the coffee gratefully despite its bitter taste. "Normally 3 days hard riding to Santa Fe. But with the ladies and considering the condition everyone's in," Ellery shrugged, "5 days, maybe 6, and that's if we don't run into any more trouble along the way." "We'll run into trouble," Nayeli said with quiet certainty. "Harrigan has too much at stake to simply let us ride away. He'll regroup, gather more men, and come after us again." "Maybe, but next time we'll be ready for him." Foster's youthful optimism was admirable, if perhaps naive. "We've got the evidence we need, and we know what we're up against." "Do we?" Sana looked up from the documents she'd been studying. "Because these papers tell a story that's bigger than just water rights and land grabbing. Harrigan isn't just trying to control one territory, he's planning to reshape the entire Southwest." She held up a letter bearing an official territorial seal. "This is correspondence between Harrigan and the governor's office discussing plans for statehood. But not just Arizona statehood. They're talking about combining Arizona and New Mexico territories into a single state, with Harrigan controlling the water resources for the entire region." Davidson whistled low. "That would make him one of the most powerful men west of the Mississippi." "It gets worse," Sana continued, producing another document. "There are references here to similar operations in Colorado and Utah. Harrigan isn't working alone. He's part of a consortium of businessmen who are systematically gaining control of water rights throughout the Western territories." The implications were staggering. If successful, such a conspiracy would give a handful of men effective control over the settlement and development of millions of acres of frontier land. It would determine which towns prospered and which ones withered, which ranches thrived, and which ones failed, which mining operations succeeded, and which ones were strangled by lack of water. "All the more reason to get these documents to federal court as quickly as possible," Ellery said. "If this conspiracy is as widespread as these papers suggest, we're dealing with something that goes all the way to Washington." "Which means we can't trust anyone in the territorial government," Davidson added. "Anyone we encounter between here and Santa Fe could be on Harrigan's payroll." Caleb shifted position, trying to find a way to sit that didn't put pressure on his bruised ribs. The fight with Cain had been won, but the victory had come at a cost that he was only beginning to appreciate. Every muscle in his body ached, and his old war wound was throbbing with renewed intensity. Nayeli noticed his discomfort and moved closer, producing the small leather pouch she'd given him earlier. "The herbs?" she said simply. "Now would be a good time." "I'm fine," he insisted, though the words came out more sharply than he'd intended. "No, you're not, and your pride isn't going to help anyone if you collapse tomorrow when we need you most." Her voice carried the kind of no-nonsense authority that reminded him of army medics who'd seen too much suffering to tolerate false bravado. Reluctantly, Caleb accepted the pouch and emptied its contents into his coffee cup. The herbs released a pungent aroma that was both earthy and medicinal, not unpleasant, but definitely unfamiliar to his palate. "What exactly am I drinking?" he asked. "Willow bark for the pain, white sage for inflammation, and a few other things my grandmother taught me to mix." Nayeli's expression softened slightly. "It won't cure everything, but it will help you function tomorrow." The tea was bitter, but no worse than army coffee, and Caleb found himself oddly comforted by the ritual of preparing and consuming it. There was something deeply human about the act of one person caring for another's wounds, something that transcended cultural differences and political divisions. "Your grandmother was a medicine woman?" he asked. "Among other things, she was also a storyteller, a keeper of tribal history, and one of the few people who could read the old Spanish maps that the missionaries left behind." Nayeli's voice carried a mixture of pride and loss. "She died when I was 16, but not before teaching me everything she could about healing and survival." "Sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was. She used to say that the desert teaches two kinds of people, those who learn to adapt and flourish, and those who fight against its nature and perish. She spent her whole life trying to teach our people which path to choose." It was a philosophy that resonated with Caleb's own experience. The frontier demanded a certain kind of flexibility, an ability to bend without breaking when circumstances changed. Those who remained rigid in their thinking rarely survived long in a land that cared nothing for human plans or preferences. "What will you do?" he asked. "If we succeed in bringing down Harrigan, what happens to you and your sisters?" "We rebuild," Sana answered before Nayeli could respond. "We find the scattered members of our tribe and bring them home. We restore the sacred places and plant new crops in the old fields. And if the courts don't return your land, then we find new land and build a new home," Tiva said quietly. "We've lost everything before and survived. We can do it again if we have to." Their resilience was humbling. These three women had watched their family murdered, their village destroyed, and their entire way of life systematically erased. Yet they still spoke of the future with hope and determination. It made Caleb's own self-pity over his war wounds seem petty and self-indulgent. "There's something else we need to discuss," Ellery said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "The matter of compensation." "Compensation?" Nayeli's eyebrows rose. "Federal law provides for payment to civilian witnesses who provide testimony in cases involving territorial corruption. Given the value of the information you've provided, you're entitled to a substantial reward." "We don't want money," Sana said firmly. "We want justice." "Money can be justice," Davidson pointed out. "Enough money to buy new land, establish new homes, perhaps even hire lawyers to pursue additional legal remedies." It was a practical consideration, and Caleb could see the sisters weighing the implications. Pride was a luxury they could ill afford when their people were scattered and homeless. "How much money?" Tiva asked quietly. "Hard to say exactly until the case is resolved, but probably several $1,000s. Maybe more if the conspiracy proves to be as extensive as these documents suggest." Several $1,000s was a fortune. By frontier standards, enough to buy a good-sized ranch, establish a business, or support a family for years. It was also, Caleb realized, far more money than he'd ever possessed in his entire life. "We'll think about it," Nayeli said diplomatically. The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as they finished their makeshift meal and prepared for sleep. Ellery assigned watch schedules with 2 men always on guard, while the others rested. It was a sensible precaution, though Caleb doubted that Harrigan would risk a night attack in unfamiliar terrain. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, Caleb found himself thinking about the ranch he'd bought for $35. Was it still his? Did he want it to be the property deed in Byumkin? His saddlebag seemed like a relic from another lifetime, a document that represented dreams and plans that no longer seemed relevant. "Having second thoughts?" Nayeli asked softly. She was lying nearby, close enough to speak without waking the others. About what? About buying land that comes with so much blood on it. Caleb considered the question seriously. I don't know. This morning I thought I wanted nothing more than to disappear into the desert and live out my days in peace. Now you've discovered that there's no such thing as staying out of other people's fights. Something like that. He turned to look at her in the dying firelight. What about you? Any second thoughts about trusting a white stranger with your family's survival? Every few minutes, she admitted with a slight smile. But my father used to say that you judge a person not by their words or their appearance, but by their actions when they think no one is watching. And what did my actions tell you? That you're either very brave or very foolish, possibly both. It was an assessment that Caleb couldn't argue with. Certainly his decision to get involved in this fight hadn't been based on any rational calculation of risks and benefits. It had been pure instinct, the same impulse that had driven him to enlist in the army, despite having no particular political convictions about slavery or states' rights. Why did you really buy the ranch? Nayeli asked. And don't tell me it was just because you wanted solitude. Men who truly want to be alone don't usually buy property near established settlements. The question touched on something that Caleb had been avoiding thinking about for months. Why had he chosen Arizona territory over Colorado or California? Why had he been drawn to this particular piece of land despite its obvious shortcomings? I don't know, he said finally. Maybe I was looking for something I couldn't name. A place to start over, I suppose. A chance to be someone other than a broken-down ex-soldier with nothing to show for 10 years of service except scars and bad dreams. And now I'm wondering if maybe the land chose me instead of the other way around. If somehow I was meant to be here when you and your sisters needed help. That's a very Apache way of thinking, Nayeli observed. The idea that the land has its own will, its own purpose. Maybe your people aren't the only ones who understand that. The night sounds of the desert began to assert themselves as the human conversation died away. The distant call of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. It was a harsh landscape, but not an empty one. Life persisted here in forms adapted to extremes of heat and cold drought and flash flood. Caleb was drifting toward sleep when the sound of approaching horses brought him instantly alert. He reached for his revolver while Ellery and his men took defensive positions around the camp. Easy, came a familiar voice from the darkness. It's Davidson and Morrison returning from the ranch. The two men rode into the firelight looking grim and travel-stained. Davidson in particular appeared shaken by whatever they'd discovered during their investigation. What did you find? Ellery asked. Bodies, Morrison replied tersely. A lot of them, buried in a mass grave about a quarter-mile from the main house. How many? 17, maybe 18. Hard to tell exactly because... Davidson swallowed hard, because they'd been there for a while. But there were personal effects, jewelry, clothing, weapons that matched descriptions of the missing Apache villagers. The confirmation of what they'd all suspected still hit like a physical blow. Hearing about massacre was different from seeing the evidence of it buried in unmarked graves. There's more, Davidson continued. We found evidence of other killings, other burial sites. This wasn't Harrigan's first operation, it was just the most recent. How many other sites? Nayeli asked, her voice carefully controlled. At least 3 that we could identify. Maybe more that have been better concealed or have had more time to weather. Davidson looked directly at her. Ma'am, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your people weren't the only tribe that Harrigan targeted. The systematic nature of it was perhaps the most chilling aspect. This hadn't been a crime of passion or even simple greed. It had been a carefully planned campaign of extermination carried out with the efficiency of a military operation. We also found this, Morrison said, producing a leather satchel, hidden in what was left of the barn. More documents, including financial records showing payments to territorial officials and correspondence with other conspirators. Ellery examined the new evidence with growing excitement. This is even better than what we retrieved from the canyon. We've got names, dates, amounts, everything we need to prove the scope of the conspiracy. And we've got something else, Davidson added. A letter dated just 2 weeks ago discussing plans for what they call the Nevada operation. They're planning to expand into the next territory. The revelation that Harrigan's crimes were ongoing rather than historical added new urgency to their mission. Somewhere in Nevada, another group of native people might be facing the same systematic destruction that had befallen the Apache village. All the more reason to reach Santa Fe as quickly as possible, Ellery decided. We'll break camp at first light and push hard for the territorial capital. What about Harrigan? Foster asked. He's got to know we found the bodies by now. Let him know, Ellery replied grimly. At this point, we've got enough evidence to hang him 10 times over. The question isn't whether we can convict him, it's whether we can stay alive long enough to get him to trial. The remainder of the night passed without incident, though few of them slept well. The knowledge of what lay buried near the ranch cast a shadow over their small camp, a reminder of the stakes involved in their desperate race to federal court. Dawn came gray and cold with a wind that carried the promise of changing weather. The desert sky, so mercilessly clear the day before, was now dotted with clouds that suggested the possibility of rain or worse, snow in the higher elevations they would have to cross to reach Santa Fe. As they prepared to break camp, Caleb found himself thinking about the men buried in those unmarked graves. Fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, all reduced to anonymous bones in the desert soil. Their deaths demanded justice, but justice was a luxury that seemed increasingly distant as the magnitude of Harrigan's conspiracy became clear. "Ready?" Nayeli asked, checking the cinch on her horse's saddle. "As ready as I'll ever be," Caleb replied, though he wasn't sure that was true. His ribs still ached from the fight with Cain, and the herbal tea had only done so much to ease the stiffness in his old war wound. But they were out of time and alternatives. The trail out of Whispering Canyon proved to be even more treacherous than their entry had been. The narrow passage that had seemed manageable in daylight became a maze of shadows and hidden obstacles in the pre-dawn darkness. More than once, someone's horse stumbled on loose rock or shied away from a crevice that seemed to drop into the earth's very center. "How much farther to open ground?" Foster asked, his nervous energy made worse by the claustrophobic confines of the canyon. "Another mile," Tiva answered, though her voice suggested that even that relatively short distance would be a challenge. The youngest sister was holding up better than expected, but the strain of the past few days was clearly taking its toll. They had covered perhaps half that distance when the sound of gunfire echoed through the canyon behind them. Not the random shots of hunters or the celebratory gunplay of drunken cowboys, but the systematic firing of men engaged in serious combat. "They found our trail," Morrison said grimly. "How many?" Ellery asked. "Hard to tell from the sound, but more than yesterday. A lot more." The implication was clear. Harrigan had used the night to gather reinforcements, probably calling in men from his various operations throughout the territory. Instead of the dozen riders they'd faced at the canyon entrance, they might now be dealing with 20 or 30 armed men. "Can we outrun them?" Davidson asked. Ellery looked at their small party, 3 injured women, 2 men still recovering from yesterday's ordeals, and horses that were already showing signs of exhaustion. "Not likely. We need to find defensive ground and make a stand." "Where?" The canyon walls rose vertically on both sides, offering no possibility of escape or flanking maneuvers. They were trapped in a natural corridor with enemies approaching from behind and unknown obstacles ahead. "There," Sana pointed toward a section of the canyon where a rockfall had created a natural barrier across the passage. "If we can reach that choke point, we can force them to come at us a few at a time." It was sound tactical thinking, but it also meant abandoning any hope of escape. Once they committed to defending the rockfall, they would be trapped until either their ammunition ran out or their enemies gave up. Do it, Ellery decided. It's our best chance. They spurred their tired horses toward the barrier, racing against time and the sound of pursuit that was growing steadily louder behind them. The rockfall created a gap barely wide enough for two men to pass side by side, with loose stones and boulders providing excellent cover for defenders. Positions, Ellery ordered as they reached the barrier. Davidson, Morrison, take the left side. Foster, you're with me on the right. Rowan, get the ladies behind the biggest rocks and keep them down. Caleb helped the three sisters find cover behind a house-sized boulder that had fallen from the canyon wall sometime in the distant past. The stone was scarred by weather and time, but it was solid enough to stop rifle bullets and positioned to provide good observation of the approaches. How much ammunition do we have? He asked Ellery. Maybe 50 rounds total, counting what the ladies might be carrying. It wasn't much for what could turn into an extended siege. What about you? Caleb checked his revolver and the rifle he'd taken from Mitchell back at the cave. 20 rounds for the rifle, 6 for the handgun. Then we make every shot count. The first of Harrigan's men appeared at the far end of the canyon. Perhaps 10 minutes later, a lone scout riding cautiously and scanning the walls for signs of ambush. When he spotted their defensive position, he wheeled his horse around and disappeared back the way he'd come. Here they come, Foster said unnecessarily. The attack, when it came, was everything Caleb had expected, and worse. Harrigan had indeed gathered substantial reinforcements, at least 25 men armed with rifles and moving with the coordination of experienced fighters. But more disturbing was their leader, a man Caleb recognized from his army days. Colonel Marcus Webb, he breathed. You know him? Ellery asked. Former cavalry officer, cashiered out of the service for excessive brutality toward Indian prisoners. Caleb's stomach clenched as he remembered the stories that had circulated about Webb's methods. If Harrigan's hired him, then this just became a military operation. Webb was positioning his men with professional efficiency, sending riders to scout for alternate routes while establishing a base of fire that would keep the defenders pinned down. It was exactly the kind of methodical approach that had made him effective against Apache war parties, and exactly the kind of patient siege warfare that their small band couldn't hope to survive. Demand for surrender, Foster observed as a white flag appeared at the far end of the canyon. Let's hear what they have to say, Ellery decided. Webb rode forward alone, his military bearing unmistakable even at a distance. When he was close enough to be heard without shouting, he stopped and called out his terms. You're surrounded and outnumbered 5-1, he announced. Surrender now, and I guarantee safe passage for the federal officers. Continue to resist, and you'll all die in this canyon. What about the Apache women? Ellery called back. They're wanted for murder and theft. They'll be turned over to territorial authorities for trial. It was a lie, and they all knew it. The three sisters would be dead within an hour of surrendering, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves like their murdered kinsmen. Counteroffer, Ellery replied. You withdraw your men, and we'll forget this encounter ever happened. Webb's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. Marshal, I've got 25 rifles and all the time in the world. You've got maybe 6 guns and limited ammunition. This isn't a negotiation. It's a demand for surrender. Then I guess we'll have to decline, Caleb called out. Your choice, Webb replied. But remember, you're the ones who chose to die for a handful of savages and a lost cause. The former colonel wheeled his horse around and trotted back toward his lines, and Caleb knew that the real fighting was about to begin. The first rifle shot cracked like thunder in the confined space of the canyon, the bullet striking sparks off the rocks just inches from Caleb's head. Within seconds, the morning air filled with the deadly whisper of lead as Webb's men opened fire from concealed positions along the canyon walls. Stay down, Ellery shouted over the din, though his words were barely audible above the cacophony of gunfire echoing off the stone walls. Caleb pressed himself against the boulder, feeling the vibrations as bullets struck the massive stone that sheltered them. Beside him, Naeli was loading a rifle with steady hands, her face calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Her sisters crouched nearby, Sana clutching a revolver, while Tiva held a handful of cartridges ready to reload for anyone who needed ammunition. "I count at least 15 muzzle flashes," Davidson called out from his position. "They've got us in a crossfire." It was a grim tactical situation. Webb had positioned his men to create overlapping fields of fire that would make any movement suicidal. The defenders were effectively pinned in place, unable to advance or retreat, slowly using up their limited ammunition, while their enemies could afford to be patient. "We need to thin their numbers," Ellery said, raising his rifle to return fire. His shot was answered immediately by 3 others, forcing him back behind cover as stone chips flew like shrapnel. "There!" Naeli pointed toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards down the canyon. "2 men behind those boulders. If we can take them out, it opens up that flank." Caleb followed her gaze and spotted the position she'd identified. It was a good tactical observation. Eliminating those 2 shooters would indeed reduce the crossfire and possibly create an escape route, but reaching them would require crossing 20 yards of open ground under heavy fire. "I'll go," Foster said, already checking his weapons. "No," Caleb replied firmly. "You're too young and you've got family waiting for you back in Tucson. This is my fight." "It's all of our fight," Ellery corrected. "But Rowan's right about one thing. Whoever goes needs experience under fire. Foster, you stay here and keep the ladies safe." Before anyone could argue further, Caleb was moving. He sprinted from boulder to boulder, using every scrap of cover available, while bullets whined around him like angry hornets. His old war wound screamed in protest, but adrenaline and desperation kept him moving forward. He reached the target position just as one of Webb's men was reloading, catching the shooter with his rifle empty and his attention focused on his ammunition. Caleb's first shot took the man's center mass, dropping him instantly. The second shooter spun around, trying to bring his weapon to bear, but Caleb was already moving, tackling him before he could fire. The 2 men rolled across the rocky ground, fighting for control of the rifle between them. Caleb's opponent was younger and stronger, but desperation gave the former soldier an edge that youth couldn't match. When the struggle ended, Caleb was alive and the other man wasn't. "Rowan," Ellery's voice carried across the canyon. "Get back here." But as Caleb prepared to make his return dash, he spotted something that changed everything. There, working their way along a narrow ledge about halfway up the canyon wall, were 3 of Webb's men with ropes and grappling hooks. They were positioning themselves to rappel down behind the defender's position, turning their temporary fortress into a death trap. "Flanking movement," he shouted, pointing toward the climbers. "They're coming down the wall." His warning came just in time. Ellery and his men swung their rifles upward, engaging the climbers before they could complete their descent. 2 of the 3 men fell, their bodies bouncing off the canyon walls before hitting the ground with sickening thuds. The 3rd managed to reach the canyon floor, but Morrison's rifle put an end to his flanking attempt. The failed assault seemed to frustrate Webb because the intensity of fire from his remaining men increased dramatically. They were no longer conserving ammunition or trying to maintain tactical discipline. They were simply pouring lead into the defensive position, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer volume. "We can't keep this up," Davidson said during a brief lull in the firing. "We're down to maybe 20 rounds between all of us." "Then we need to try something different," Naeli said quietly. She had moved to where she could observe the enemy positions, studying their deployment with the eye of someone trained in warfare. "They're concentrated in 3 main groups. If we could get behind one of them—" "How?" Foster asked. "There's no cover between here and there." "Not along the canyon floor," Sana agreed, "but there might be another way." She pointed toward a crack in the canyon wall that Caleb hadn't noticed before, a narrow chimney that climbed almost vertically before disappearing into shadows above. "That leads to an old mine shaft," Tiva explained. "It connects to several tunnels that honeycomb this whole area. If someone could reach it, they could come out behind Webb's men," Caleb finished. "But it's a 30-foot climb under fire." "Not under fire," Nayeli corrected. "Under cover. If the rest of you keep Webb's attention focused on this position, one person might be able to reach the chimney without being seen." It was desperate, but it was also their only chance. Staying pinned in their current position meant certain death when their ammunition ran out. At least this plan offered the possibility of turning the tables on their attackers. "I'll go," Caleb said. "No," Nayeli replied firmly. "You're injured and you don't know the mine shafts. It has to be me." "Absolutely not. I'm not sending a woman into that kind of danger." "This woman has been navigating these tunnels since she was a child," Nayeli shot back. "And this woman isn't asking your permission." Before Caleb could protest further, she was gone, slipping away from their position with the fluid grace of someone who had learned stealth as a survival skill. He watched her make her way toward the base of the canyon wall, using every shadow and depression for concealment. "Cover fire," Ellery ordered. "Keep them busy." They opened up with everything they had, pouring bullets toward Webb's positions, in a sustained barrage that forced the attackers to keep their heads down. It was a dangerous gamble. They were using up their remaining ammunition at an alarming rate, but it gave Nayeli the distraction she needed. Caleb held his breath as he watched her begin the climb. The chimney was narrower than it had appeared from a distance, forcing her to wedge herself between the rock walls and inch upward, using her hands and feet for purchase. One slip, one moment of lost concentration, and she would fall 30 feet onto unforgiving stone. But she climbed with the confidence of long practice, moving steadily upward until she disappeared into the shadows above. For several long minutes there was no sign of her, no indication of whether she had successfully navigated the mine shafts or become lost in their dark passages. Then, just as their ammunition was nearly exhausted, rifle fire erupted from an unexpected direction. Webb's men, suddenly finding themselves under attack from behind, scattered in confusion as Nayeli emerged from a hidden tunnel mouth and began picking them off with deadly precision. "Now!" Ellery shouted. While they're confused, the remaining defenders charged from their positions, using the chaos created by Nayeli's surprise attack to close with their enemies. The battle became a series of individual fights scattered across the canyon floor, desperate struggles between men who knew that surrender meant death. Caleb found himself face to face with a bearded giant who swung a rifle like a club, trying to crush his skull with the weapon's heavy stock. He ducked under the swing and drove his knife into the man's ribs, feeling the blade grate against bone before finding its mark. Nearby, Foster was wrestling with a man twice his age but half his determination. The young deputy's inexperience showed, but his courage more than made up for his lack of skill. When the fight ended, Foster was still breathing, and his opponent wasn't. Through it all, Webb maintained his position at the far end of the canyon, directing his remaining men with professional calm, even as his tactical advantage evaporated. But when he saw that the battle was turning against him, the former colonel made a decision that revealed his true character. Instead of continuing to fight or attempting to withdraw, Webb grabbed the nearest hostage, one of his own wounded men, and put a gun to the injured soldier's head. "Stand down," he shouted. "All of you drop your weapons or this man dies." It was the act of a coward using his own follower as a shield when the battle turned against him, but it was also tactically effective. None of the defenders could risk an innocent man's life, even if that man had been trying to kill them moments before. "Let him go, Webb," Ellery called out. "It's over. Your men are dead or scattered, and you're outnumbered." "Is it over?" Webb's voice carried the edge of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Because from where I stand, I've got a hostage, and you've got a choice to make." The standoff stretched out for long seconds, with both sides frozen in a tableau of violence and moral complexity. Then Tiva's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Colonel Webb," she said quietly, stepping into the open despite the obvious danger. "That man you're holding, what's his name?" "What?" Webb seemed surprised by the question. "His name. Surely you know the names of the men who follow you into battle?" Webb's hesitation revealed the truth. He had no idea who he was threatening to murder. To him, his own men were nothing more than tools to be used and discarded as circumstances demanded. "His name is Billy Carson," one of the wounded attackers called out weakly. "He's got a wife and 2 kids in Tucson." The revelation seemed to shake something loose in the hostage's captor. Webb's grip on his weapon wavered slightly, and in that moment of uncertainty, Nayeli struck. She had worked her way around to a position behind Webb while everyone's attention was focused on the standoff. Her shot was perfect, a single bullet that dropped the former colonel, instantly freeing his hostage and ending the battle with surgical precision. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by the moans of wounded men and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Smoke from dozens of rifle shots hung in the air like morning fog, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood. "Is everyone all right?" Ellery asked, though he was clearly favoring his left arm, where a bullet had grazed him. A quick count revealed that they had all survived, though not without cost. Davidson had taken a bullet in the shoulder. Foster was sporting a wicked gash across his forehead from flying rock fragments, and Morrison was limping from a ricocheted bullet that had torn through his boot. But they were alive, and more importantly, they still had the evidence that could bring down Harrigan's conspiracy. "What about them?" Foster asked, gesturing toward the few surviving attackers. "We take the wounded with us," Ellery decided. "They might be willing to testify in exchange for leniency. The dead," he shrugged, "the desert will claim them same as it claims everything else eventually." It was a harsh calculation, but a practical one. They couldn't spare the time or resources to properly bury their enemies, not when Harrigan might send another force after them at any moment. As they prepared to leave the canyon, Caleb found himself standing beside the body of Colonel Webb, the man who had terrorized Apache villages and corrupted everything he touched. Was now just another piece of carrion for the buzzards. There was a certain justice in that, though it felt less satisfying than Caleb had expected. "No celebration?" Nayeli asked, joining him beside the corpse. "Should there be? I don't know. In the old days, warriors would take trophies from defeated enemies, proof of their courage in battle. And now I think we've all seen enough death to last several lifetimes." She looked around at the carnage scattered across the canyon floor. Victory feels different when you're fighting for survival instead of glory. It was an observation that resonated with Caleb's own experience. The battles he'd fought during the war had been driven by abstract concepts like duty and honor. This fight had been about something more immediate and personal, the right of innocent people to exist without being murdered for someone else's profit. "We should go," Morrison said, approaching with their horses. "If Harrigan sent this many men, he might have more in reserve." The journey out of the canyon proved to be considerably easier than their entry had been. With the immediate threat eliminated, they could travel at a steady pace without constantly watching for ambushes. The wounded men, 3 of Webb's followers who had survived the battle, rode under guard, their cooperation secured by the promise of federal protection in exchange for testimony. As they emerged into open desert, the full scope of their situation became clear. They were still 3 days from Santa Fe, traveling through territory where Harrigan's influence reached into every town and settlement. Their small party included multiple wounded people. They were low on ammunition, and their enemies had resources that seemed virtually unlimited. But they also had something that Harrigan couldn't buy or intimidate: the truth documented in papers that revealed the full scope of his conspiracy. It was a powerful weapon if they could survive long enough to use it. There, Sana pointed toward a column of smoke rising in the distance. "That's smoke from the railroad station at Cedar Springs. If we can reach it, we can send word ahead to Santa Fe," Ellery finished. get federal marshals moving to provide escort for the final leg of the journey. It was a sound plan, but Cedar Springs was still 12 miles away and the town was notoriously corrupt. Half the officials there were probably on Harrigan's payroll, which meant they would be walking into potential danger rather than safety. "Do we have any choice?" Davidson asked. Despite his wounded shoulder, he was still thinking tactically. "We need medical attention for the wounded, fresh horses and supplies. Cedar Springs is the only settlement within 50 miles. "Then we go to Cedar Springs," Caleb decided. "But we go in ready for anything." As they rode toward the distant smoke, Caleb found himself thinking about the ranch that had started this whole adventure. It seemed like a lifetime ago that he'd paid $35 for what he thought was worthless desert land. Now he understood that no land was truly worthless. Every acre had a history, a purpose, a story written in blood and dreams, and the endless struggle between those who would build and those who would destroy. The ranch might still be his legally speaking, but it belonged to something larger now. It was part of a fight for justice that stretched far beyond property lines or water rights. It was about the kind of society they wanted to build in this harsh but beautiful land, and whether that society would be based on law or force, justice or greed. "What will you do afterward?" Nayeli asked, riding beside him as they approached the outskirts of Cedar Springs. "When this is all over?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I suppose that depends on how it ends." "And if we win, if Harrigan goes to prison and his conspiracy is exposed?" Caleb considered the question seriously. A week ago, his greatest ambition had been to find a quiet place to live out his remaining years in solitude. Now, having tasted battle again and found a cause worth fighting for, that dream seemed empty and selfish. "Maybe I'll rebuild," he said finally. "The ranch, I mean, make it into something worth having." "You'd stay, even knowing what happened there. Especially knowing what happened there. Someone needs to remember the people who died. Someone needs to make sure their sacrifice meant something." Nayeli smiled, the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen on her face since their ordeal began. "I think my father would have liked you. I wish I could have met him. Maybe you did in a way. Maybe that's why you were there when we needed you most." It was a beautiful thought, and one that gave Caleb more comfort than he expected. The idea that his presence at the ranch hadn't been mere coincidence, but part of some larger pattern, some cosmic justice that brought the right people together at the right moment. Cedar Springs materialized out of the desert heat like a mirage, its collection of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts looking both welcoming and ominous in the afternoon sun. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and they could see people moving about their daily business, unaware of the drama that was approaching their quiet settlement. "Remember," Ellery said as they rode into town, "we don't know who we can trust here. Stay alert, stay together, and be ready to fight if necessary." The main street of Cedar Springs was typical of frontier railroad towns, wide enough for freight wagons lined with businesses that catered to travelers and railroad workers. A hotel, a saloon, a general store, and a small church comprised most of the commercial district, while residential areas spread out in all directions. But something felt wrong. The few people visible on the street moved with nervous energy, and more than one pair of eyes tracked their progress with obvious interest. Word of their approach had somehow preceded them, which meant that Harrigan's network of informants was even more extensive than they'd realized. "There," Morrison pointed toward the railroad station. "Telegraph office is in the same building." They had made it perhaps halfway down the main street when the trap was sprung. Men emerged from buildings on both sides of the street, all armed, all moving with the coordination of a planned operation. At the same time, a voice called out from the hotel's second-story balcony, "That's far enough, Marshal Ellery." The voice belonged to Marcus Harrigan himself, impeccably dressed despite the frontier setting, flanked by two gunmen who kept their weapons trained on the street below. His presence in Cedar Springs could only mean one thing: he had anticipated their route and prepared an ambush. "Mr. Harrigan," Ellery replied calmly, though his hand rested on his weapon. "You're under arrest for conspiracy murder and violations of federal law." "I don't think so, Marshal. You see, you're in my town now, surrounded by my men, and a very long way from federal jurisdiction." Harrigan's voice carried the confidence of a man who controlled every variable in the equation. "Federal jurisdiction extends everywhere in the territories," Ellery shot back. "And I've got evidence that will put you away for the rest of your life." "Evidence?" Harrigan laughed. "You mean those papers you stole from my property? I'm afraid they won't be admissible in any court, considering how they were obtained." It was a legal technicality, but one that might have merit, depending on the judge and jurisdiction. Harrigan was clearly confident that his political connections would be sufficient to suppress any evidence obtained through what could be characterized as illegal search and seizure. "We'll let a federal judge decide that," Davidson said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Oh, I don't think it will come to that," Harrigan replied smoothly. "You see, you're all going to meet with an unfortunate accident here in Cedar Springs. Tragic, really, a group of federal officers killed while resisting arrest by local authorities." "On what charges?" Ellery demanded. "Murder, for one thing, the killing of Colonel Webb and his men. Theft for another, the illegal appropriation of private documents, and of course, harboring fugitives." Harrigan gestured toward the three sisters. "Those Apache women are wanted for multiple crimes throughout the territory." It was all lies, but lies backed by enough guns to make them temporarily true. Harrigan had turned the entire legal system into a weapon, using badges and warrants to legitimize what was essentially organized murder. "You won't get away with this," Tiva said, her young voice carrying surprising strength. "The truth has a way of coming out eventually." "Does it?" Harrigan's smile was cold as winter wind. "Tell me, girl, what truth emerged from the massacre of your village? What justice came from the deaths of your people? Sometimes the truth is simply what the winners choose to write in the history books." But even as Harrigan gloated over his apparent victory, Caleb noticed something that gave him hope. There, at the far end of the street, a cloud of dust was rising, riders approaching fast and in significant numbers. If those were federal reinforcements. "Expecting company," he called out to Harrigan. The businessman's confident expression flickered as he turned to look in the direction Caleb was pointing. The approaching riders were still too distant to identify, but their numbers and speed suggested something more than casual travelers. "Sheriff Patterson," Harrigan called to someone in the crowd below, "take some men and see who's coming." But before Patterson could respond, the lead rider came into clear view, and Caleb's heart leaped with recognition. It was a federal marshal's badge, glinting in the sunlight, and behind the marshal rode what looked like an entire company of cavalry. The cavalry of the United States Army, riding to the rescue like something out of a dime novel. Harrigan's face went pale as the implications became clear. Somehow word of their situation had reached federal authorities, and the government's response had been swift and overwhelming. Whatever political protection he thought he enjoyed, it apparently didn't extend to open warfare against federal marshals and army troops. "This isn't over," Harrigan said, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "You may have won this battle, but the war is far from finished." But as the federal reinforcements rode into Cedar Springs with sabers drawn and rifles ready, Caleb allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice might actually prevail in this harsh and beautiful land. The fight wasn't finished. It might never be finished. But for today, truth had triumphed over force, and law had overcome corruption. The $35 ranch had cost him more than he'd ever imagined, but it had also given him something he hadn't known. He was looking for a cause worth fighting for, people worth protecting, and a home worth defending. In the end, that seemed like a fair bargain.